that that may trigger some discussion because in talking to our hosts here and to people in other countries as well who are working on open data, I think there are many, many themes that apply globally. So I'm here to share my experience and hope that it will be useful to you, and we will of course have time for some questions and discussion. So I wanted to begin just by giving you a little bit of my background because it will explain, I think, how not only how I think about open data, but how many people in the US come to be interested in this topic. My background is actually as a journalist. I was the editor and executive vice president of Consumer Reports magazine, which tests cars and refrigerators and looks at healthcare and all kinds of consumer products and services, and really has been one of the institutions in the United States that for a long time has been focused on putting data to good use. But what was very interesting to me was that after I left Consumer Reports, I was invited to join the Federal Communications Commission as head of the Consumer Bureau, and began to see there the tremendous potential that government data in particular has to help consumers in everyday decision making. From that, I became interested in open data more broadly, not only in its impact for consumers, but its impact on policy, on public services, and on business creation. I did have a chance to write this book, Open Data Now, as you've seen, which was an experience that enabled me to network with many, many people working on open data. And that in turn led me to the Governance Lab at NYU. The Governance Lab, or the Gov Lab as we call it, is all about using technology to improve the connection between government, citizens, the public sector, and the private sector. And we think that open data is one of the real routes to doing that. So before I give you a whole analysis of open data as we see it, I want to start with an open data story that I think is an example of how a lot of us are now thinking about the potential and the power of open data. So this is a story about a man named Dara O'Rourke, who is a professor of environmental science at the University of California in Berkeley. Dara was a man who had spent about 20 years of his life looking at environmental and labor problems in the US and all over the world. And one day at his home in California, he had a sudden realization that these were issues that actually struck very close to home. He and his wife were at the beach, putting sunscreen on their young daughter. This was about 8 years ago. And he suddenly realized that even though he was an expert on the environment and chemicals and health, he had absolutely no idea what was in that sunscreen that they were putting on his daughter's nose at that very minute. So Dara was a very respected professor. He went back to the University of California and worked with his graduate students. They did some research, and they found out that actually top-selling sunscreen in the United States included chemicals that had been banned in Europe and in some countries around the world. He found out that his daughter's favorite toy contained lead. He found out that her shampoo had a substance that was suspected of causing cancer, and he suddenly realized that he needed more information, he needed more data in order to make choices that would be healthy for his family. Well, he was a very smart man, he had very smart graduate students. One way to do this would simply be to go to a large store and pick up, several different brands of sunscreen, several different kinds of shampoo, and just look at the label of each one and just try to figure out which one was safest. Well, the problem with that is that if you go to the store and do that, it looks kind of like this. There are so many different products, so many different types of products that nobody, not even an environmental expert, can look at them one by one. So what Dara O'Rourke realized was that the solution to this was open data. And he began to look not, at this kind of label reading exercise, but he began to look for sources of open data that he could use and his colleagues could use to make it easier for consumers to make these kinds of choices. He ended up starting a company called Good Guide. They are what is called in the United States a B corporation. It's a new type of corporation, meaning that they not only have a financial responsibility to their investors, but they actually also have a social responsibility to make sure that they're serving a social public good. And what Good Guide does is they help people find safe, healthy, and green, environmentally friendly products. And if you go to their website, it looks pretty much like this. You can take any product, any consumer product, not quite in the world, but at least in many parts of the world, and certainly the US, and get estimates. If you care about health and nutrition, you can see how it scores on that basis. If you care about environmental impact of having manufactured it, you can look at it that way. But what's very interesting about this from the perspective of open data is that while this website looks very simple, it is actually powered by more than 1,500 different data sets, many from the Environmental Protection Agency, but many from other sources as well. So this is an example of going out, finding open data, finding large numbers of data sets, often very complex data, and figuring out how to make it actually important and useful to solve real-world problems for real people. Well, this is, I think, really a kind of classic story of open data business. And what we're finding in the work we do at NYU is that many, many open data businesses are driven not only by the opportunity to make a profit, but also by social good. So we're seeing the emergence of a whole class of businesses that use this incredible resource in many ways that benefit themselves and benefit society. Well, I want to pause just for a minute and talk about what open data is. This is the definition that I used in my book, that it's free public data that can be used to launch commercial and nonprofit ventures, conduct research, make data-driven decisions, and solve complex problems. So it's data that has great utility in many different ways. When we say it's free public data, I think there is a growing assumption that government open data should be free to the public, or at least not have more than a very minimal charge, and that it can be used in a number of different ways. It has to be in a format that's usable, preferably machine readable, so that it can be computed, and it has to be accessible. People have to know where to find it and how to use it. Now, people often ask about the relationship between open data and big data, and I've put together this diagram to try to sort it out. Big data and open data are clearly very related, but they're also very different in their use and in who has access to them. So if you look all the way over at the left, there's a category of big data that that is never available to the public. So for example, a major retail chain like Walmart in the US might collect data on all its customers so that they can figure out who's going to buy what at what time, how to target to them, how to market to them, and so on. But that's data that only Walmart has. Nobody else will have it. Or any number of governments will collect data for national security reasons. Whatever those data might be, those are not going to be publicly available. Those will be closely held by the government. So a lot of big data is collected in ways that it is useful only to the people who collect it and manage it and essentially own it. Open data, on the other hand, is completely different. By definition, it is all about sharing the data and making the data available to anyone, and it can be big data or it could be small data. But the thing that's important about it is not the size or complexity of the data set. The thing that's important is the fact that it's open and that anyone can use it. So for example, on the right-hand side, what I've called public data from state, local, or federal governments, for example, a city budget. It's not big data, but it's very important data, and making it open in a useful way that everybody can analyze is tremendously valuable. And then in the middle, what I've called large public government data sets. This is sort of the maximum opportunity, when you have very large, big data from the government that's made available for free to the public. That's when some of the most remarkable things can start to happen. And we've seen that with weather data, geospatial data, census, healthcare, and many other areas, and I'll be showing you many examples today. The open data landscape that's evolving really is profound. It changes the world for business people, for entrepreneurs, for established businesses, for government, for investors, scientists, journalists, consumers. It really is a phenomenon that has broad impact in a number of ways in our society and our economy. And there are, I would say, essentially three different kinds of impact: social good, business efficiency, and new business creation. So I'll give you a few examples of each. Social good, This is a website, this is a nonprofit, so it's not a commercial venture, but it's called Great Schools. This is a website that uses open data mostly from the states in the United States, because each state collects its own data on education, and also adds in ratings of public schools from parents. And they have been able to evaluate public schools all over the country using this methodology. Now, what's amazing about this is that this website is now used by almost half of all families in the United States that have children from kindergarten through elementary school, middle school, and high school. So it's clearly filling a tremendous, tremendous need in a way that we find many open data projects and businesses do that. Another example, a very interesting one, is ProPublica. So we have in the US a couple of organizations. This is probably the most prominent nonprofit organization that, as they say, does journalism in the public interest. What they've been able to do is take open government data and do analyses that find really very important news stories with great public value based on the data they find in government. And they actually, in many ways, partner with the government. So to give you an example, our Department of Health and Human Services collects a tremendous amount of data on Medicare, the program in the US that provides health care for people over 65 and some others in need as well. And they recently released data that not only showed how much Medicare was being charged, but how much each doctor was charging Medicare. And they were, so what ProPublica did is they then took that data and they began to tell stories with it, like they found an eye doctor who had made about $20 million off of Medicare in a single year. That's a lot of eye exams. So, you know, either this doctor was very, very fast and very good, or something funny was going on. So so ProPublica got a good story. The people in Health and Human Services were very glad to see this story come out, because it helps them fight people who are trying to cheat the government, and it helps them fight fraud. So we're seeing the development of real kind of collaboration between government agencies and journalistic entities for social good. Another area, as I said, is improving operational efficiency. Open data can be very helpful for companies that already exist but want to do business better. For example, United Parcel Service has been around for decades in the US, delivering packages all over the country. What they're doing now is they are putting sensors in each of their trucks that tell them exactly where each truck and even each package is at any given time. And then they combine that with open data from the government mapping and geospatial data, and they're able to use that to make their routing much more efficient and get packages where they need to go much more efficiently. They save money, they serve customers better, and open data really helps them improve what they do. And then the third area, and this is the one that my group at NYU has studied the most, is business creation. So one of the most interesting and important trends now is that open data is giving birth to hundreds and hundreds of new businesses. So you see here some very, very happy tech entrepreneurs. They're grinning because this was a year ago. They had just won a major technology contest in New York, and their company got a nice check for $50,000, but more important, they got tremendous visibility and credibility. This company, which is called Enigma, what they do is they work with, their business model is to make government data more useful for other businesses. So they work with, I think, about 100,000 data sets now from federal, state, and state governments, and they put all of those data sets on a common platform so that anyone can use them much more easily than if they were going to the original data set. In a study that we've done that I'll be describing in a few minutes, we found that the single largest category of data-driven new companies was this kind of company, companies whose job is to make data more useful more broadly. So you're seeing a tremendous engagement from some of these new companies, really engaging with governments at all levels to create new kinds of applications and new kinds of uses for open data. Well, this leads you to ask, how much is open data really worth? We talk about it as a major economic driver. Are we talking about hundreds of millions, hundreds of billions? Well, McKinsey did a study last year that estimated that the total global value of open data every year is $3 to $5 trillion. Well, this was a number that got everyone's attention. It also aroused some skepticism. It is higher than any other estimates that have come, for example, out of studies in the EU or the United Kingdom and so on. But nevertheless, it puts a benchmark out there that's very interesting. I mean, could we really get this tremendous kind of economic value out of open data? So one of the first questions is, where are the big companies? If we're really talking about trillions of dollars, there must be some really big companies out there that are built on this kind of data. Well, the one that has now become the sort of most cited example is the Climate Corporation. This is a very, very interesting company. They began several years ago thinking that if they could analyze data more effectively than their competitors, they could provide better kinds of weather insurance. So farmers, for example, have to be insured so that if frost comes and their crops die, they get something back for it. Traditional weather insurance, you have to prove the economic loss. You have to show how many of your crops died because of the weather. They wanted to take an approach that would understand weather so well that they could actually predict and say, okay, if the temperature drops below such and such degrees, your crops will be in trouble. We know that. We will pay you simply if it drops below that point. But in order to do that and stay in business, they had to be able to predict weather and its effects very, very accurately. So they went deep, deep, deep into the data. They ended up with data that they could now take a patch of farmland about the size of this conference room, and they could tell you based on soil quality, rainfall measured to the 100th of an inch, changes in climate, and so on. They could tell a farmer exactly what to plant, when to plant it, how to prepare for the effects of climate change, and so on. And they believe that they can now increase profitability for farmers around the world by about 20 to 30%. Well, this is clearly a big open data company, and they were bought by Monsanto for about $1 billion last year, which also a lot of open data entrepreneurs have now taken that, I think, as their standard. It's like, oh, you know, if they can get to $1 billion in 6 or 7 years, maybe somebody else can. We'll see. But what I think is very, very striking about them is that at least initially, they relied almost entirely on free government data. So I think they now use some proprietary sources as well, but they were able to build this huge amount of value based on a resource that theoretically anybody in this room could have accessed. And the way they did it was through the power of their analysis, their vision, and what they could do with the data, not that they had unique access to it. And that's the story, really, I think, of all open data companies. They're showing us that this free public resource can lead to tremendous value when people add value and how they apply it. Now, the Climate Corporation is not alone. These 5 companies are what you might call the Open Data billion-dollar club. Garmin in geospatial data, the Weather Channel, Zillow and Zoopla, both working with real estate data. All of these companies now are worth $1 billion or more. So it clearly is possible for large companies to develop out of using open data. But you would that's still not enough to get you to $3 trillion. So one of the questions that we began asking at the governance lab is, are there ways that small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, smaller companies can use open data in a way that it really kind of permeates the economy? It's not just a couple examples like this, but it's a much broader impact. So to find that out, we launched a study called the Open Data 500, and our goal was to find 500 US-based companies that used open data that really were built on open data, either their whole business or an important part of their business. Now, people often ask why we picked 500. Well, somebody one day was talking about wouldn't it be great if we could have a Fortune 500 for open data? My colleagues and I thought that was an interesting idea. We said, sure, we could do that, and then we started trying to figure out how. About halfway through, we thought we had made a big mistake, but in fact, we were able to get to 500 companies, and it is the first comprehensive study of open data as it's used in the US. And what we've learned, the reasons for doing this were threefold. One was to essentially take up the McKinsey challenge and see if we could demonstrate the economic value of open data. We are not trying to quantify it and see how many billions it adds up to, but we are trying to demonstrate broad economic value and see if that can be found. Second, we wanted to create this study in a way that new entrepreneurs thinking about using open data could see profiles of companies that are already doing it and figure out how that might apply to them. And then finally, we wanted to create a dialogue between the people who provide data and the people who use it. And I think in many ways this may be the most important study outcome. So if you go to opendata500.com, you'll see something like this. This is, I'm not internet connected, so I can't show you the whole thing. But this will show you 500 companies, and as you can see from the screen, there are many ways you can sort them. So you can click on a state, it will tell you how many open data companies are in that state. You can sort by the category of company, whether you want to look at only education companies or only healthcare companies, you can do that. And then on the right, you can also filter by federal agency, because we're looking at companies that operate on a national scale. Most of them use federal data, although some use state data across the country. And you can look at, for example, which companies use Department of Labor data, which companies use Department of Agriculture data, and so on. So this is not just a listing, it's a way of beginning to sort and analyze the open data universe. Now, there are 5 areas. We did find 15 categories of company, but there are 5 areas that we found where there's the most open data activity, and these are also areas where the Obama administration has put a lot of emphasis. Health, transportation, education, energy, and finance. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of each one to give you a sense of the breadth of uses that we're seeing. So in healthcare, there's a very interesting company now called AIDIN, A-I-D-I-N. And this company is all about helping people who get out of the hospital find good care for post-hospital care, rehabilitation, and so on. And it started because the founder, a man named Russ Graney, had his uncle was in the hospital, his uncle needed care after he got out, and what they gave the family was something that looked like this. It was simply a list of the names of providers, their addresses, and their phone numbers. No information on quality or the history of the institution or anything. So the family chose a provider that was nearby. It turned out not to be good care, and Russ Graney said there must be a better way. So he created AIDIN, which pulls together all kinds of information from the Department of Health and Human Services and other sources, and it now gives you a complete rating and evaluation of any center that you might want to go to. So it's possible, again, going back to my roots with consumer reports and consumer information, you can now make much, much better choices. It improves the market because a health facility that scores low here is going to want to do better, and it completely changes how people choose this kind of care. Another one is ITriage. This is a company that uses the open data about providers, healthcare providers, so that if you're traveling in a strange city, you wake up with a chest pain, you can put in your symptoms into this app. It will tell you if you might be having a heart attack. It will tell you where the nearest emergency room is, how to get there, and it could potentially save your life. In transportation, this company called KeyChain Logistics has been described as Uber for truckers and shippers. So it connects people with things to ship to the trucks that can ship them. But it does more than that. They also use open data on federal open data on safety records so that they can be sure that they are connecting their clients to companies that will not only take their merchandise or whatever it is and transport it, but that will do it safely and do it in an effective way. In education, one of course, the huge problems we have is the cost of higher education. And one of the things that has become true in the U.S. is, I don't know if it's true here when you buy a car, but in the U.S. when you buy a car, there is the sticker price and the real price. So you go up, you look at the car window, and there's a price that says, I don't know, $30,000, and then you argue with the dealer and you get it down to the real price, which might be $24,000. Turns out colleges are the same way. They also have a sticker price and a real price. And there is now legislation in the U.S. that requires colleges to reveal what they call the true price. And the true price is, what would it really cost for a particular kind of student in a particular situation to go there, because colleges offer a lot of financial aid because they realize that very few people can pay the actual quote-unquote sticker price. So by using All Tuition, this website will tell students and their parents what they will actually pay for a good college. And this means, for example, that a low-income student who is very good at science and math might be able to go to MIT for the same cost that he or she could go to a local small college that would not have anywhere near as good an education. So it opens up opportunities for students all over the country who otherwise just would not know where to look and would not know that they had these opportunities. Energy, a lot of the work we're doing now on open data is, or the companies are doing, is focused on energy efficiency. There's a lot of work on climate change in this context. Excuse me, I'm sorry. I get very excited talking about open data. Sometimes I choke up. So this is a company that puts sensors in these buildings, sees how the energy is being used, and then combines that with open data from the Department of Energy about energy efficiency and how they can save money. The current use of energy and the ways that companies and buildings use energy is so primitive that one of the biggest sources of waste is the fact that buildings are always running heating and cooling systems at the same time, right? So you heat up the room, it gets too hot, now you're putting on the air conditioning, now it's cooler. Total waste of money. So with these sensors, they can help buildings operate much more efficiently, and they're now in about 17 million commercial buildings. This is another company, O-Power. They are much more focused on individuals, and what they do is they give you access to your own energy use data together with information from Department of Energy open data about how to operate more energy efficiently. And what they also do, which is very clever, is they tell you how much energy your neighbors are using, because you don't want to be more of an energy, you don't want to be more wasteful than your neighbors. And they're getting people to conserve energy, and they work very closely with utilities in the US. And then finally, in finance, we're seeing a wide range of applications. This company called OnDeck does a great service to SMEs, to small companies. The problem that small companies have when they're starting up is that if they want to get a loan from a large bank, the large bank is not going to have time to do the due diligence that lets them know whether the company is a good risk, because they're small. You know, the bank would spend all this time, and then it's just a small loan anyway. This company actually does that due diligence for them. They will evaluate small companies as a good or bad risk based on all kinds of public open data. They can then decide whether or not to give them a loan, and they facilitate these small business loans very well. And on the other end of the spectrum, for the equity markets, there's a company now that's using all kinds of data. There are about 40,000 global companies that are publicly traded, and they will update information on every one of those overnight in a very readable form using all kinds of open data. Now, one of the things I wanted to mention to you, I had the opportunity to work recently with the US Chamber of Commerce Foundation, which is kind of the research arm connected with the Chamber of Commerce. They have just put out a study called The Future of Data-Driven Innovation, which you might find interesting, and that long URL on the bottom is how you get that. But I was invited to write a chapter on open data, and part of that was analyzing the different ways that open data companies make money. And as you can see, and you'll see if you access the report, we're looking at licensing, advertising, consulting, subscription models, analytics, and lead generation, basically getting a customer for another company and getting some money back for that. These are all business models that open data companies are using now. So again, they're taking free open data and they're turning it into something that they can make a profit from in a very legitimate way. But at the same time, if you think about the examples I just showed you, they're all about improving access to education, improving energy efficiency, getting small businesses going. All of these companies, or at least I think the great majority of them, are also serving a social good at the same time. So what we've done in the Open Data 500 is not only study the companies and their revenue models, but what we've also done is we've really tried to map the territory that shows exactly how government agencies connect to different categories of companies. So if you go to our website, opendata500.com, you'll see this circle on the home page, which we call the Open Data Compass. Right now, it's like somebody has clicked on the lifestyle and consumer category on the left. And on the left are categories of companies, and on the right are government agencies. So somebody clicked on lifestyle and consumer, and you can see that companies in the lifestyle and consumer category are drawing data from Department of Labor, Department of Health and Human Services. You can see where all the connections are. Well, this mapping has been very, very interesting because it's enabled us to begin to work with government agencies as well. With government agencies in figuring out how they can make their open data more useful. So I want to give you a very, very quick. Good. Thank you. Is that good? Thank you. I want to give you a very, very quick, like 2-minute overview of the state of open data policy in the U.S. and then show you how we're working with agencies to make that work better. So we think of open data in 2 very large categories. One is data that the government releases about how it does its own business, spending, taxes, and so on. And the other is data that government releases because it has collected data about the weather or, you know, publicly traded companies or things like that. So one is the role of government as an accountable entity, and the data helps make government more accountable. The other is the role of government as a data provider. So on the first one, we have recently passed milestone legislation called the Data Act. It stands for Digital Accountability and Transparency. If this is implemented well, then U.S. federal spending will be much more transparent. You'll be able to learn much, much more and in a more detailed way than has ever been possible. Right now, the only real spending data that the public has tells you like the first big contractor that the government gave money to for a project. This will let you see the subcontractors, the sub-subcontractors. It lets you trace a dollar all the way down to the last person who spent it. So it's a tremendous tool for visibility. And what's very interesting is you may know that in the U.S., Republicans and Democrats do not always see eye to eye on the same things, and that our Congress has not been especially functional lately. But this particular legislation passed Congress almost unanimously because both parties agree that it's very important to have this kind of government transparency. Now, the other kind, which is the role of government as a data provider, is the kind of open data that we've been studying. Now, what has driven this largely is the open data policy that President Obama announced in May 2013. And he announced a number of changes about how government agencies are now expected to share their data. But what's very interesting is he announced this, he didn't announce this at the White House, he announced this at a technology startup company or a collection of startups in Austin, Texas. And he said, as you can see here, he said that open data is going to help launch more businesses, going to help more entrepreneurs come up with products and services we haven't even imagined yet. So the open data policy from the beginning was geared towards helping businesses do more business in the ways that you've seen. Now, the policy requires many things. The first is a presumption of openness, or some people call it open by default, which means that agencies are expected to release data unless there is some compelling security or privacy reason not to. Should be machine readable, reusable, timely. And the last part, developed with consultation. If you remember when I talked about the Open Data 500 study, I said that the third goal we had was to get a dialogue going between government agencies and the people who use their data. The open data policy actually says that government agencies need to consult with data users in order to improve their open data policies. The problem is that they really had no good idea how to do that. Well, that's where our team at the GovLab has come in. We had this very radical idea that all these high-tech, technology-focused questions and problems that people have around open data, that you might actually be able to get somewhere with a very low-tech approach of getting people into a room and having them talk to each other. So this was an interesting idea that I think several other countries, including here, I think are developing open data programs with a lot of this kind of consultation. It had not happened in the US. Our open data programs have been going for several years, and there really had not been this kind of dialogue. So what we've been doing is we've been setting up what we call open data roundtables, which bring together people from government, like the gentleman on the left, people from business, like the woman on the right, who, in very structured dialogues, we plan the days very carefully, we scope it out very carefully, and we do it in a way that they can really talk to each other about data and how to improve the data. We are very gratified that when the White House announced the official U.S. Open Data Action Plan this May, they particularly cited our roundtables and said that specific actionable feedback from these sessions and others can improve descriptions, formats, and accessibility of government data. So we're very pleased that they recognize what we're doing as a key part of improving the use of open data in the U.S. So all of these different agencies, there's about a dozen agencies on this screen, including environment, labor, agriculture, health, treasury, many others. For all of these agencies, we have now either run these roundtables like the one I just showed you, or we're actively planning to do it with them. So we've gotten tremendous interest from the agencies who see this as a way to meet their requirement to get feedback from customers, and we've seen tremendous interest from businesses because now they have access to government to improve what they do. In every time that we've done this, we've been fortunate to find somebody in an agency who really wants to push for change. In the case of the first one, the Department of Commerce, that person was Under Secretary for Economic Affairs Mark Domes, who really championed this idea and helped us get it done. This was held in June, this kind of roundtable meeting, and 1 month later, we had a real impact. In July, Secretary of Commerce Penny Pritzker, who you can see there in front of our favorite slide here on open data, she announced that the Department of Commerce would now hire its first ever Chief Data Officer and would set up a business advisory council to help them figure out how to issue their data more effectively. And she said at the time that while of course there were many factors that went into this decision, the roundtable meeting that we held really pushed them to make this decision because they heard from so many business people that these things were needed. Whoops, sorry. Just very briefly, we've also done a session with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Actually, in this particular session, one group, we broke out into different groups. One group actually developed a plan for an app that would help alert people when there were possible food emergency problems in their area. And the chief scientist of the USDA, Catherine Witecki, also talked about the tremendous importance of using open data to solve all kinds of agricultural problems. So what we found, and I'm just going to show you this very quickly, but we have now issued our report on the Department of Commerce Roundtable. It has many recommendations for how to improve their issuing and use of open data. And we also found a number of different ways that government open data could be improved. They all, things like making it easier to discover and find data, improving data quality, and so on. At the center of all of that is the concept of data users as customers. So the Department of Commerce, for example, now talks about the people who use their data as their customers. That's not a concept that we had a year ago. A year ago, federal agencies felt it was simply their role to collect data, put it out there in some form, and wait to see what happened. They are now getting much more focused on meeting the needs of people, businesses that use their data, and I think that's a very positive trend. I don't have the URL, but if you're interested, if you simply do a search for Open Data 500 Department of Commerce, you will immediately get to a link where you can see our report and see what we've brought out of that. We are now trying to use the same methodology internationally because we believe many countries face the same kinds of issues and problems. And again, you can see this if you go to our site, opendata500.com and /MX will take you to this. We just announced a few weeks ago in Mexico City, we have a partnership with the President's Office of the Government of Mexico to replicate the Open Data 500 there. They will do it with 100 companies. The first 20 are already up, and we hope to have 100, list of 100 by sometime around February or March. So I just before I close, and I hope we have time for a few questions, I wanted to sort of synthesize all of this and say, what have we learned from all of this, particularly as it applies to government open data? Well, I think the first thing that we've learned overall is that there seems to be tremendous interest and eagerness both on the government side and on the business side to have these conversations, to figure out how to make open data a real national resource, and we've seen that as a very positive trend. But I would say there are probably 7 things that are keys to successful open government data, at least from what we've seen in the US, and they may apply in other countries and here as well. So the first is to establish policies and laws to support open data. The Data Act on government transparency is going to have a tremendous impact, hopefully, and there would really have been no other way to get to that level of transparency on government spending. President Obama's open data policy is also very important. Federal agencies have some degree of autonomy in the US. it's not always easy to get them to follow an executive order like that, but it has set a stage and it's set a standard that makes it much, much easier for us, for example, as advocates for open data, to go in and begin the kinds of dialogues that need to happen. Publishing data inventories for public use is a huge issue. Many agencies have been collecting so much data for so long that they're not sure what they have. This is just a common government problem. Figuring out what's there and publishing it in an inventory is very important, because when the business community and others can see the full range of what kind of data might be available, they know what to ask for, they know what they're interested in, they're not only limited to things that are already out there. Third, data is more important than websites. It's been a debate for a while about, let's take our Department of Health and Human Services. Do they need to put up a really consumer-friendly website that shows people where the best hospitals are and so on? Well, in that particular case, they've done a lot of work, but if they had not done that, a company like Aiden or somebody else would have been able to take their data and create that website themselves. And very few federal agencies have really done things in as consumer-friendly a way as Health and Human Services did, and we're beginning to think that that's actually absolutely fine. That the role of government is not primarily to put out consumer-friendly websites, it's primarily to put data out there so that developers and companies and entrepreneurs and nonprofit organizations can take the data and do things with it that will be of great use to the public. So that actually relieves, I think, some of the burden on government agencies, but it does put on more of a burden to release data well. Make data available for free. We are lucky in the US to be in an unusual situation, which is that by law, any federal information or data cannot be copyrighted. So with a couple of exceptions, generally data is provided for free. But in the UK, for example, right now, the UK has had very active, very really globally leading open data policy and program, but there are certain very important data sets that they charge for. And there's a lot of concern now that that may really undermine the goals of open data. This is a difficult one, particularly if an agency has a history of making its budget partly by charging for data. But really, we're seeing globally more and more the idea that to be truly open data must be free, particularly for small businesses. Because if the price is too high, then only the large established companies will be able to use it, and you really stifle entrepreneurship. Next, hire chief data officers. Everybody needs a chief data officer. I would like to have one in my life, but more and more federal agencies are seeing the need for this. It's a different role from a CIO or a CTO, although they're very complementary. And I think it's becoming a more and more established way of managing data. Teaming up with businesses. I think the most exciting thing for me about the roundtables that we've held is that the energy of the discussion. So the business people who come, the government people who come, really seem like they have been wanting to have this conversation for a long time. And I think the more governments can team up with businesses to identify priorities for data, ways of releasing it, and so on, it really becomes a very positive, self-reinforcing ecosystem. And then finally, we all have to cure what we call data hugging disorder. So when we first started the open data policy in the US, people would complain that the agencies had data hugging disorder. It's like, my data, I know what to do with it, don't tell me what to do with it, don't tell me what to make open. I think we've come a long way very fast, simply by realizing this as a problem. Agencies have begun to change, and it's simply something that has to be part of the culture. We all have to develop a culture of opening up data. One of the issues that has been a problem, I think, everywhere, and we certainly see it in the US, is that government data is not always of the best quality, and we have to get used to the idea that that is okay. I mean, we have a number, I could talk for a long time about data sets in the US that are very problematic. They have bad geospatial data, they're incomplete, they're out of date, they're only available as PDFs and so on. But we're starting to get to a culture where we say, it may seem embarrassing, but it's simply the way it is. And if an agency is putting that information out there saying, we know this isn't the best it can be, it was collected 20 years ago under systems that were built 30 years ago, we want to improve it, help us improve it, there is a real opportunity for a kind of partnership that can take this all forward in a spirit of openness and a spirit of collaboration. So I'm going to wrap up now, and I hope we have some time for questions, but I hope I've given you a sense of how we see open data from our perspective, not only in the US, but in beginning to work more and more with countries like Mexico, also Australia, others who are working on similar open data policies. I am, of course, again, very, very honored to be here, very eager to work with all of you in any way that we can to be helpful. And ultimately, what we're looking for is a world where there is enough open data that we can all make better decisions, make better choices, and even figure out what sunscreen to use for our kids. So, thank you very much, and we'll open it for questions. Thank you.
现在我们这边再开放20分钟时间，让大家自由提问。请问现场有没有哪位朋友？我们有同步翻译的耳机，所以您可以用中文或英文都可以进行。欢迎各位。